This is the first of 3 movies in the CISA series that covered information technology, service delivery, and support. And for this little triad of movies, I'm going to take a little bit different approach. I'm going to start out with the first movie taking kind of a philosophical approach as we look at the OSI architecture. And I'm going to use my famous allegory, the Fellowship of the Token Ring, to explain the 7 layers of the OSI architecture and the elements that lie therein. Then what we're going to do in the following 2 movies is we'll actually look at the actual IS network infrastructure as it works within the framework of OSI. And then in the 3rd movie, we'll look at information systems operations, information systems hardware, and IS architecture and software. Sound good? All right, let's get started with the Fellowship of the Token Ring. In our adventure, the Fellowship of the Token Ring, we have the Queen of Domain A. She's got a tough challenge. There's been a recent attack of a brutal gang of marauders called the Spam. Maybe you've heard of them, or perhaps their cousins, the Spim. Well, she desperately needs help to handle this nuisance. So she's going to call upon her ally, the King of Domain B. Now, this actually presents another problem for the Queen. She needs to get an urgent message to the King, but the King lives in a domain far, far away. She can't give it to the catapult guy and say, hey, fling this message over to King B, or put it on an arrow and pull it back and fly it out over to the King. Not only is the King quite a ways away, but this message is also going to involve some things like security. Obviously, this is an urgent, secure message from one leader to another, so it needs to be secured. It needs to be formatted differently because you know what? The King speaks a different language than the Queen does. They use a different kind of ink in the Queen's domain than they use in the King's domain, and the infrastructure of roads in the Queen's Queendom is completely different than the infrastructure of roads that is used in the King's Kingdom. So the Queen and the King will rely on a handful of people, some helpers, some special members of their court, to facilitate this process of getting this urgent message from the Queen to the King and back from the King to the Queen. And if you'll remember from the actual Lord of the Rings movies, if you've seen those, there was a Fellowship of the Ring, and there were 9 players in that fellowship. Well, in this fellowship, we happen to have 7 players, 7 participants in this Fellowship of the Token Ring. By the way, if you don't know what Token Ring is, it's kind of an older IBM method for making local area networks. So that's my tongue-in-cheek play on words here. So the first thing the Queen's going to do is she's going to put her trust in a very special individual, a trusted individual, somebody who is actually well-versed in communicating directly with the Queen and these other 6 players, or the other 6 members of the Fellowship. So who's she going to call? Well, it ain't Ghostbusters and it ain't Spider-Man. It's the scribe, the trusted scribe. He's the one that's going to get the ball rolling. Now what she's probably going to do is dictate this message orally to the scribe, or she may scribble it down on a notepad or maybe type it into some type of device, but the bottom line is the scribe's the one that's going to get this information in its most raw form and start to do some magic to it. So in this one-act play, it's the job of the scribe to basically transform this message in whatever raw format he received it in into something that's now a little bit more understandable. He's going to convert it into the proper symbolic language. Perhaps he'll make copies of this message onto parchment, several copies to put into the royal record-keeping room. The scribe will be the first point of contact for any graphical information. Perhaps the Queen needs to jot out a map, for example, for the King to use, or other graphical type information. Well, the scribe's the first point of contact. He's the first member of this Fellowship of the Token Ring on the sender side. The scribe deals with graphics and alphanumeric characters, different types of code sets depending upon the languages, Unicode, for example. Now, ultimately what he's doing is really kind of a twofold process. She's preparing this message that he receives from the queen so that he can hand this thing off to the other player, the person that he's used to interfacing with on a regular basis. But he's also considering the scribe in the other domain, or the scribe that belongs to the king, King B. So logically, he's communicating with the scribe in the other kingdom, but from a real practical standpoint, he's the interface between the original message from the queen and the next player in this Fellowship of the Token Ring. And obviously, we're dealing with kind of, royalty here. So we're talking about certain protocols that have been put in place, certain rules and regulations for communication. So the scribe, of course, is going to use certain protocols, and he's going to be handing off certain types of data, and this data is going to be kind of packaged up or compartmentalized into a unit. So he'll be dealing with what we call protocol data units. Now, obviously, the scribe, who's a very literary person, is not going to jump on the horse, grab a bunch of maps, maybe a chunk of beef jerky and some water, and physically deliver this message across all the roads of Queen A's domain and get it over to King B. No, 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 no. He's going to find an individual that he is used to working with on a regular basis that's going to kind of perpetuate this process. Besides, quite a few other things have to happen to this message first before it's really ready to be transmitted across this very elaborate network between Queen A and King B. So the scribe is going to take this message from the queen and then kind of take this scroll, this protocol data unit, and then hand it to the next player, who's the royal translator. The royal translator is a transformer. He's a composer, okay? He takes this message, this protocol data unit, this scroll he gets from the scribe, and he starts to perform some activities on it. So he may take the data and apply some cryptography to it, maybe encrypt it with some type of royal cipher code. He may actually have to compress the message. Perhaps it's a really long message, and so it takes up a bunch of scrolls. It's just too big for this horse that's going to ultimately carry it. So maybe he has to kind of look for a lot of common things in it and then convert it and then compress it. So it's a smaller message. It can be decompressed on the other side. He may have to do some different formatting or convert it from one type of code to, let's say, ASCII code. He basically has to convert this outgoing message into some kind of format that's going to be acceptable by the other players in the Fellowship of the Token Ring. The parties that are farther down in this process, he may have to do some translation and conversion to make it more compatible for them. Now, remember, the royal translator is part of the same guild, or perhaps the same secret society as the scribe. So, in our terms, he's part of the same operating system. Now remember, he's actually interfacing between the scribe and the next player in our fellowship. So he's communicating directly with them, but logically, he's talking to the royal translator over in King B. So it's the royal translator that will ultimately be decrypting and decompressing and detranslating and decomposing at the same kind of level that the royal translator is here for the queen. Now, is the royal translator going to hop on his horse and deliver the message himself? Absolutely not. The scribe and the royal translator, they're not really the most athletic of people. So he's going to, and again, there's still more things that must be done to get this message from the queen to the king. So the royal translator is going to put this particular formatted message in its own particular type of protocol data unit, and he's going to pass this down to somebody he's very well versed in communicating with, another player in the fellowship, the broker. The broker is the one that controls these different sessions between the queen and the king. The bottom line is this. When the king or the queen send a message to the other domain, it's quite possible that they're sending a message to somebody else in the court, not just the queen. Perhaps it's a duke or a bishop or a jester or a knight or the count or the archduke. I mean, you get the idea. And also realize this. Yes, this is a single message that the queen is sending to the king saying, you know what, help, I'm being attacked by the spam or the spam. But there may be several simultaneous messages going on between the king and the queen over a period of time. So This particular broker is like the wheeler and dealer. He's the mover and the shaker of the fellowship. He establishes, he manages, he terminates these communications between these local fellowship members and also remotely to the king. All conversations, all exchanges of data, all of the dialogues between the participants and the scribe and the royal translator in the queen's castle are being managed by the broker. And in the same way, the broker in the king's castle is also managing and wheeling and dealing all the dialogues and conversations and data exchanges for his royal translator and subsequently the scribe and all the other members of the court in the king's castle. Now, obviously, the broker's way too busy to deliver this message himself. Besides, he has really no idea how to get the message from the queen's castle to the king's castle. He couldn't care less. So he's going to rely on sending this message to somebody that he's used to interfacing with on a regular basis, the most worried person in the fellowship, the most worried person in the kingdom, the middle manager. As a matter of fact, since the middle manager is the one that has to kind of make sure that these messages, these communications are done reliably, he's a pretty worried individual. As a matter of fact, think about the middle manager in your business or in some business you've worked for. They're typically the most worried man or most worried woman in the organization. They have to be experts at dealing with the people above them in management and the people that are below them, the ones that they manage or the ones that they supervise. So the middle manager is truly in the middle. If you think about, we've got 7 players here. He's right there. She's right there in the middle, interfacing between the broker and these lower levels. He may have to resize these scrolls and break them up into smaller scrolls. He's responsible for sequencing the scrolls and making sure that if they are sent or they arrive in a different order, which is quite possible, he has to put them back in the correct order. He's responsible for making sure that all the information sent from the broker over to the king's domain is actually received. If there's a problem, if there's an error along the way, he has to have mechanisms in place to recover from that area and control the flow of these scrolls as they move from the queen to the king. For a lot of the communication, the middle manager is waiting for some type of acknowledgement back from the king saying, you know what, I received the message. And if he doesn't get an acknowledgement back in a certain period of time, he's going to go ahead and resend that particular scroll. Maybe one piece of the communication or the entire communication. Some of the messages or some of the scrolls that the middle manager sends and receives may have higher priorities than others, so he has to prioritize these messages. So he's a very, very busy guy. Now, as you can tell by looking at the middle manager, he's had his fair share of cheeseburgers. So this is not the guy that you're going to pick because he's extremely busy and so is the broker. He's not the guy that you're going to pick to actually deliver this message. As a matter of fact, he has no idea about the actual route and the roads and the infrastructure that it takes to get these messages to the other side or even where they come from. So he's going to hand this message off to another member of the Fellowship of the Token Ring. The map maker. You know, as I look at these two fellows here and I think about myself, I realize that after years and years of being in information technology, information systems, chances are I was probably going to end up looking like one of these guys or the other. Now, I'm not going to tell you exactly which one of these guys I'm starting to look more like. As a matter of fact, I'm probably starting to look like more of a hybrid of both of these guys. But anyway, it's the map maker who interfaces with the middle manager. You see, the map maker is the one that actually kind of knows the paths. He knows the routes. And there's multiple routes. There's multiple channels between the queen's domain and the king's domain. The map maker is going to ultimately create this virtual circuit between the operations of the middle manager in the queen's castle and literally the operations of the middle manager over in the king's castle. The map maker is going to deal with addresses. I know this is a long time ago in our allegory, but they're using addresses back then just like we're using addresses now. You know, 1500 West Excalibur Lane or whatever. So the map maker has to deal with different types of addresses. Not just the addresses that he uses, but also the addresses that are used for the person under him that he's communicating with. The middle manager also has his kind of own, we call them addresses. They're really ports with numbers assigned to them. So the map maker has to kind of interface between those ports and the numbers, his addressing scheme, and whatever addresses are being used by the layers under him. So this map maker is an extremely bright and intelligent and busy person. Depending upon the scenario, the map maker may have a limited or extremely fluent knowledge of the topology of routing these scrolls from place to place to place, all along the way between the queen and the king. Different domains, different queendoms and kingdoms are going to share different amounts of information between each other, depending upon their relationship. This map making capability may be a manual process, or it may be a dynamic, ever-changing process with the map maker depending upon some more advanced protocols or software. Now, you would think with the map maker's knowledge of the routes and the addressing schemes and his intimate relationship with the middle manager and those below him, you would think that he would actually be the one delivering the message. But if you think that, you'd be thinking wrong. The map maker is not the one that actually delivers the message. But you know what? We're getting a whole heck of a lot closer. The map maker is going to take this information. He's going to, and realize when he got the scrolls for the middle manager wrapped his own kind of scroll around that information. That scroll is what we call a header. So the middle manager kind of wrapped his own, think about it as a fax cover sheet, okay? The middle manager kind of placed his own fax cover sheet over his message and handed it down to the map maker. Well, the map maker is going to have information, control, routing, addressing information on his scroll. So he's going to put his own, we'll call it fax cover sheet, or his own scroll. He'll wrap it around that message, and that becomes his protocol data unit that he's now going to hand down to the next player in the fellowship, and that would be the Royal Horseman. The Royal Horseman is going to take that scroll and the special scroll wrapped around it, or, that fax cover sheet. He's going to strip it away, and he's going to look at this information, and he's going to actually be the one. Now we're starting to get very close to the actual delivery of the message. You can see here we've got a Royal Horseman. We've got a guy or a gal on a horse with the message, and we've got the underlying horse. So what this should tell us is that the Royal Horseman is actually two components, and it is. It's the guy on the horse, and it's the actual horse below. So the guy on the horse is the expert at communicating with the map maker, and the horse is the one that is actually going to interface with the road, or whatever type of pavement or highway or whatever we're using. There's several different options what we're using to actually transport that message. It's the Royal Horseman that's ultimately responsible for the reliable transfer of the data on the road or the highway. It receives these scrolls from the map maker. It's going to reformat them into a special type of protocol data unit that only the Royal Horseman and the physical road deal with. It's called a frame. So the Royal Horseman deals in frames. Let me put it this way, going back to that fax cover sheet analogy. As the information comes down from the map maker, he's going to strip away that fax cover sheet from the map maker. Then he's going to place his own fax cover sheet on the front of the information, which, by the way, this is the information that's been passed down all the way from the queen to the scribe to the translator to the broker to the middle manager to the map maker. Then, in addition to putting a fax cover sheet, he's going to put another trailer or concluding document at the end that's going to have a little bit of information that basically deals with error correction. So when he's framing the message, he's literally doing that, okay? He's putting something on the beginning, on the end, a header and a trailer, a fax cover sheet and kind of a fax ending sheet. These frames are going to have the original message from the queen, as well as control information that's needed to synchronize the communication, to detect errors, and also add some mechanisms for controlling the flow between the queen's domain and the king's domain. So the Royal Horseman and the horse he's riding on are actually moving on, we'll call it the King's Road. So the King's Road is actually the media that we're dealing with. And so what we see here are the total fellowship of the token ring. The scribe, the royal translator, the broker, the middle manager, the map maker, the royal horseman, and the horse, and of course, the King's Road. Of course, of course, of course, of course. So in the grand scheme of things, this fellowship of the token ring is really a fellowship of 7 players, 7 characters over in the Queen's domain, and the same 7 characters or 7 players over in the King's domain. Now, even though they may speak in different languages, different formats, different encryptions and decryptions and compressions and different media, different protocols, they still have the same functionality. And what really ends up happening is this message goes to the scribe does its thing, passes its protocol data unit down to the royal translator, who then does his or her thing, passes that PDU down to the broker, who does its wheeling and dealing, and then passes this datagram, we call it, datagram, to the middle manager. The middle manager is going to put his fax cover sheet on it with all of his instructions for this middle manager. Then he passes that down to the map maker. The map maker takes all that information, including the fax cover sheet of the middle manager, puts his own fax cover sheet on it, which of course this map maker is going to look at, and then hands it down to the royal horseman. The royal horseman is going to frame the message with information on the front and the end, framing it, and then sending it down to whatever medium is being used. So the King's Road is the physical media. Now, when I say physical media, it could be Ethernet, it could be some type of fiber implementation, it could even be a wireless. As a matter of fact, between the Queen's domain and the King's domain, there may be several different types of medium before the message finally gets to the King's Road. And so that's really the functionality of the royal horseman, the horse, and the road to facilitate this process from one domain to the other. Once the message gets to the King's Road, it gets passed up to the royal horseman, who's an expert, of course, at dealing with the map maker. The frame gets handed up to the map maker. The map maker strips away the stuff, the fax cover sheet on the beginning and the end, and he looks at the fax cover sheet from this map maker, looks at the instructions, hands it up to the middle manager. Middle manager strips away the fax cover sheet of the map maker, and he sees the fax cover sheet of this middle manager, follows the instructions, and hands it up to the broker in the King's domain. And of course, this may be one of several different types of messages to several different individuals at the King's castle. So of course, the broker is going to be dealing with all of that, and then the translator doing all of his decryption, decompression, detranslation, and then all the way up to the scribe. Those are the players of the Fellowship of the Token Ring. And what you've just learned is the OSI architecture, the ISO OSI model, to provide a set of open system standards for equipment manufacturers, for vendors, for application developers, for protocol specialists, to provide kind of a benchmark to allow us to have different communication systems using different protocols communicating with inter-network capabilities all over the world based on the TCP UDP IP system. So the scribe is the application layer of the OSI model, layer 7. The royal translator is the presentation layer of the OSI model. The broker is the session layer, layer 5. The middle manager is the transport layer, layer 4. The map maker, the network layer, layer 3. The royal horseman, the data link, layer 2, and the King's Road is the physical layer, layer 1. So the application layer delivers file services, print services, message services. It's the protocols and applications and services that are used for usage and advertisement. Again, it takes whatever input there is and converts it into symbolic language. It provides the graphical user interface, the windows for users and applications to access lower-level services like network services. Also, the application layer might communicate with the computer's available resources to the rest of the network. Don't confuse the application layer with application software. Application programs actually use the application layer interface to access our network-connected resources. Layer 6 is the presentation layer, the Royal Translator. This provides data translation, data conversion. It's typically part of the operating system. Remember, it's in the same guild or secret society as the scribe. It converts inbound and outbound data from one format to the other. To ASCII, for example, it handles syntax. It does encryption and decryption, depending upon which direction the information is going. Layer 5 of the OSI model is the session layer. This is the broker, establishing communication sessions and links between network devices in two different domains or two different systems. It handles dialogue control. It coordinates sessions and connections. All conversations, data exchanges, and dialogues between the application layers are managed by the session layer. Layer 4 is the middle manager, the transport layer. This is going to ensure data deliverability and reliability. It maintains data integrity by resending packets if necessary. It makes sure that the packets are ordered properly as they leave the domain and come back to the domain, making sure there's no loss or duplication. It deals with error recovery and flow control. At the transport layer, you'll have protocols like TCP and UDP. The map maker is layer 3. This is basically your layer 3 protocols. You've got routed protocols like IP, IPX, SPX, and AppleTalk, among others. And you've got routing protocols like RIP, Open Shortest Path First, EIGRP, and Border Gateway Protocol. So it deals with routed and routing protocols. It's responsible for routing, forwarding data packets, addressing, whether it be an IP address, an AppleTalk address, or an IPX SPX address. It controls packets on the basis of the state of the network by priorities and also quality of service information as well. This layer prepares the packets for the lower data link layer by converting each packet into one or more datagrams. This layer also determines the media access control or data link layer 2 addressing of the next hop or the next router to pass information to the data link layer or layer 2, the Royal Horseman. This provides error-free transmission of data frames. It sends frames from the network to the physical layer. It converts raw bits into frames and vice versa. By the time the information gets down to the physical layer, it's basically zeros and ones, either sent over a wired or wireless RF medium. The physical layer, layer 1, the King's Road, packages and transmits bits on the physical media or the wireless media. It includes encoding and functions at the mechanical and electrical level. It defines the cables, the connectors, the cards, the physical aspects of the hardware necessary to physically connect a device to the network. So the International Organization for Standardization, OSI model, basically gives us network architecture standards that improve the process for creating integrated environments that applications can use and protocols that can use to give organizations a reference model for structuring intercomputer and network communication processes. It overcomes the major challenges of interoperability, availability, flexibility, and maintainability. The model was developed in 1984 to give manufacturers, vendors, developers, engineers, and programmers protocols to support an open system architecture for internetworking. It helps proprietary systems work within the same network infrastructure seamlessly. In other words, I can develop application programs or cryptography systems, video streaming, audio streaming, graphical development packages without having to worry about what's going on down here at the session layer and the transport layer and the network layer and the physical layer. I can let other experts develop and improve these systems for me while I focus on the areas that I have expertise. Now the next logical question is, what are we going to do with this OSI layer information? Well, in the next 2 nugget movies of the IT Service Delivery and Support section of the CISA series, we're going to start mapping these layers to different local area network specifications and components, wide area network specifications and components, different devices and technologies, wireless network services, all the way up to TCP/IP Internet World Wide Web services, network administration and control, network management tools and client-server technologies, as well as utility programs and database management systems. And then we'll look at many different controls that auditors can use to analyze, evaluate, and manage these systems. And we'll do that starting in the next movie. I hope this CBT Nugget's been informative for you. I want to thank you for viewing. We'll see you in part 2.